BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
This is between you, me, and the network security boundary. Hopefully this is the talk you expected. My name is Patrick Fussell. Please take a minute to look me up on the internet. I always enjoy hearing from people or connecting with new people on Twitter. I work for PSC. My role within PSC is as a penetration tester. PSC is primarily a PCI company. I've been in this role for about, I think about 4 years now. It's sort of a dream pen test gig just because the methodology that we use, I get to do lots of fun post-exploitation work, which is really cool, and I've had the chance to work with lots of people who are smarter than me, so I've had a chance to learn lots of neat stuff. Just sort of a full disclosure, I think none of the concepts I'm presenting here are original. I'm just presenting them in a sort of a different light. A lot of these ideas are either inspired by some of my teammates or some other friends I've made in the community. I'm just putting them in a different context here. So just a quick agenda points. I want to go over a couple of concepts, a little bit of terminology. Then I'm going to review some of the common implementations for separating security zones that I've seen just experience-wise. Talk about some of the bypasses and weaknesses that are connected to those, and then wrap up talking about what I would just call sort of secure design concepts or some things I've seen in the wild that work very well for creating good security boundaries. Just terminology-wise, I know that probably anybody in this room is already experienced. InfoSec is rife with terminology and concepts that you get used in different ways depending on who it is you're talking to, whether you're red team, purple team, blue team, whatever it is you do. I think this causes a little bit of confusion, so I'm not suggesting that anything I present here is the right way. It's just the way I'm going to be using the terms, and wow, this color didn't show up at all. Imagine some circles that just came together. All right, I'll move on. Cool. So, like I mentioned, PSC is primarily a PCI company. So, often our goal for a penetration test is the cardholder data environment, often called the CDE. Our pen tests tend to take the form of starting from some portion of the network that you might consider to be unprivileged, like wireless. Then we gain some sort of foothold, escalate till we can access a portion of the network that has our target data, and try to move from there. So lots of organizations get hacked, and just because somebody asked me the last time I went over this slide deck, this is a real book. You can go buy this at Barnes & Noble. So lots of organizations get hacked. Those organizations probably at the time thought they were secure, or somebody in the organization thought that they were totally secure. I think if you were to speak to most network or sysadmins, they won't tell you that their network is impenetrable or that their systems are impenetrable. There's an understanding that things can be hacked. Given that information, it's kind of strange to me then that there still seems to be this buy-in into I think what some people call the M&M security model, where we pretend like we're secure just because we have a next-gen firewall. So the point of this is that systems get hacked. We all know that. Taking into account the high rate of success that we have in privilege escalation just within my team, and apparently the high rate of success that actual bad guys are having in gaining footholds in networks, I think it's fair for the purpose of this talk to push that sort of initial system compromise bit out of scope of the presentation. And we're just going to sort of assume compromise in some of these and kind of move from there. Okay, so just a common paradigm, we label things. Some data resources might be classified differently than others. We like to designate systems based on what it is they're doing. So in your network, maybe it's QA, dev, staging, something like that, depending on what kind of organization you're working for. You might have an organization, a network segment that represents marketing and one for HR. In terms of creating security zone, the question I think that gets asked is, do the resources in marketing need to be able to access those in HR? Or to continue on with that thought, does everything in IT need to be able to access everything in the call center? Probably yes, but it's the question that needs to be asked when you're thinking about designing the zone. So I just want to note here that for the purposes of this talk and this presentation, we are talking about environments where divisions exist that have security requirements of varying degrees. So essentially it's just saying everybody in your network doesn't need to access everything. If that is your network, then cool. This information is not going to help you at all, and you probably have an easier life than most people. So finally, production is going to be our label for the zone that contains our high value asset. We might also think of this just as a high security zone. I just chose production because I felt like it would be the thing that made the most sense to everybody when we're talking about we want to restrict access to some piece of the network. And sort of lastly, we just have to consider the boundaries and access between zones. It's logical to imagine that you do have some privileged users in your, say, let's say your IT department that do need to access that production network. This talk is going to investigate some of the barriers that are implemented so that only those intended users are getting to the intended places or intended systems. All right, so jumping into some of the common implementations, flaws, and bypasses. Just a quick note before I start on the first one. I'm going to be focusing on a very simplified version of these technologies. I understand that. I have a limited amount of time, and I don't want to dive too deep into any one. So as you're looking at these, as sort of understand, I watered these down for the purposes of talking about compromise and sort of lateral and vertical escalation exploit-wise. So the first solution I'm going to touch on, I'm calling FireCall. I've heard lots of terminology sort of describing this idea, or maybe you think of it just as just the way that you guys are set up. Broadly, you might describe what I'm going for here as any method to provide temporary emergency access to a secure system. What I want to focus on for this presentation is implementations where an organization allows or denies access through a network boundary through some sort of manual or automated change to the network access controls. This might take the form of submitting a request to IT to change the network ACLs for a system, or you might have something a little bit fancier where you have some sort of application that makes dynamic firewall rule changes. Whatever it is, it's that something in between those processes. So the first issue to consider, I think, in this situation is where the organization relies on manual firewall rule manipulation. The complexity of management over time, it can be a real beast. So networks started out with their design looking something like this, with lots of great charts and network flow diagrams and really well-defined barriers. Because of the challenges of management of these complex environments over time, something that starts out clean and sort of looking like that, again, the colors are kind of off there, looks a little bit more like this. So I think the thing to consider here is having even one exception that permits access into a controlled network environment that you aren't aware of presents a pretty significant risk. Though even more broadly, when you consider some of the exploitation scenarios, the security flaws present in this solution are, I think, even more inherent to just its functionality because those exceptions create a bridge between zones. So when there is sorry, I keep checking the colors to make sure at least you guys can see the arrows, otherwise it's not going to make any sense at all. When there is a direct bridge between the two zones, an attacker only needs to compromise a host that is the beneficiary of any of the modified rules. This bridge is easily traversed by an attacker. I think we commonly refer to this as pivoting. So what does that mean? Compromise of the lower security zone gives a direct path to the higher security zone. Just a quick example of how we might leverage this in the context of a penetration test. This is a pretty simple version, but it's something that works regularly. We start off by detecting those sort of poked network holes by collecting network connection data from a range of target systems, like we're showing here, and then use the super hacker tool grep to detect the networks we're looking for. So once we've identified the exceptions, we just fall back to hacking 101. might use some sort of post-exploitation shell. I'm using an interpreter in this demo just because I feel like it's ubiquitous. Most people will know what it is. It's pretty straightforward. And we can forward traffic through our compromised system to the production network or our target network. I think when somebody brought this up when I was demoing the slide deck to them, I think it's a good point. If this is the kind of solution that you're using, another situation to consider is if an attacker has compromised a machine they know can or will access the target system, it really just becomes a matter for the attacker of inducing a situation where we know the fire call is going to be leveraged, and now we have access. So sometimes it's just sort of timing and distance as far as actually exploiting this. So making this a secure implementation could be a pretty complex undertaking. I think just because the built-in characteristics make it pretty prone to attacks. A couple of thoughts. The smaller you can make the window of exposure, the better off you are. This setup seems the best for organizations where there are a very limited number of systems or people accessing those high-value assets. So hopefully you can place very strict controls around those users and systems. You might want to do things like restricting client-to-client communication on the networks where they reside. So do your workstations need to be able to talk to each other? Any holes that you poke, build in automated close if possible. Shorter and more specific time-wise is the best. Regular testing and confirmation of segmentation. And maybe just one other thought. Consider doing any sort of administration through some sort of air gap. If you have a separate system for managing those high-value assets, you really limit the complexity of this, and you give a secure channel that's sort of built in. All right, next up is VPN. Man, that looks kind of silly. There's some other words in there. We'll get to them. So VPN. I think everybody probably has an idea of what a VPN is, but just real briefly, virtual private network, we're creating a tunnel between our private network and some remote private network over the internet. This is pretty common. We're talking about connecting something like a production network and like a remote data center. I like this one for this talk just because I've seen an increase of use of this for production networks, especially when more organizations are putting data in things like AWS, and then they use the VPN to connect to those resources or do something like create some sort of site-to-site. So the first implementation issue I want to touch on here is the split tunnel. So with the split tunnel, we start out with the network interface on the local LAN. That's pretty straightforward. Then we add the interface that connects to the remote network. This effectively creates a bridge between the local and remote network. This is useful because it allows access to local network resources, or maybe if you need to do internet browsing, but your remote network doesn't allow any sort of outbound traffic. Well, this can provide that sort of functionality. But from the attacker standpoint, this is very easy to detect, and the exploitation scenario is identical to that of a network where there is no network boundary. So what's the follow-on to that? The full tunnel VPN. This ensures that when the VPN connection is active, the host no longer has connectivity on the local network, eliminating the bridge. Security-wise, this is definitely a superior situation to the split tunnel. For instance, if we had some sort of post-exploitation shell live on a host and we see that full tunnel go up, we should see connectivity drop because they're now no longer effectively on the same LAN as us. So that's great, but that does make bypassing more difficult. If we see that full tunnel, it's still reasonably possible to get around it. One perspective worth considering for this is that of malware. For a pen tester, we might say some sort of a specially crafted post-exploitation payload that can do things like detect changes in network interfaces before firing off a connection, something maybe to another network that we know is reachable from that target zone. So in this scenario, we just need to target a user that we know is accessing that secure environment via VPN, maybe doing something like reviewing running processes or checking AD group membership. Craft some sort of exploit and get it running on the target system. And one effective way to accomplish this is to run the binary as a service on the target host, so it's just sitting around and watching. And then we wait for that instance to happen that will trigger the loading of our evil code. So I think a theme that we see here, once the attacker has administrative access to the system, the rest of the bypass is really just limited by creativity. Just like with Firecall, if at all possible, you really want to limit any sort of local network exposure of users that have VPN access to their high security environments. We want to avoid creating direct bridges between zones, definitely rely on full tunnel. Multi-factor authentication with out-of-band confirmation is also a great perspective to consider. We'll touch a little more on MFA in the next section. Next up, talking about Jumpbox. So Jumpbox for our purposes here is any device that spans two dissimilar security zones for the purpose of access. Typically, I think we see that this is leveraging something like SSH or remote desktop. This provides a nice way to implement a network boundary by restricting connections between the zones to one target host or just a couple of jump boxes. And it also gives us a place to implement an authentication boundary. Given that this is definitely a great security posture, touching on the sort of first implementation issue is stale sessions. So we'll call stale sessions at least. So essentially, we're thinking that once we compromise a user that has a session open, which in this case is remote desktop, they leave their workstation, the session is open, I'm an attacker, I'm just monitoring that system. Once they leave, I can log in and take advantage of that open remote desktop session. The next common implementation flaw I found is what I think of as the single authentication zone. So maybe you have two networks that are dissimilar, you have some sort of segmentation between them, but they're both using the same AD. So the obvious problem here is that if you're authenticating with same credentials to two zones, are they really two zones? I would say probably not. Now, I think the attack surface here can vary greatly based on exactly what the implementation looks like. But even if the use of the jump box provides an effective network boundary, if there's some host that's spanning those two zones that's providing some sort of authentication, then the attacker can leverage that. One way the attacker might leverage this is shared infrastructure in Active Directory, something like user logon scripts. So this is actually, if you can imagine for just a second that you're looking at the user logon script in Active Directory here. In case you're not familiar, user logon scripts gives you a way to assign tasks that will be performed when a user logs on. So we can design a script that will execute or run some sort of binary of our choosing, so that when we target a particular user, when they log on, it runs some code, and we can gain access to an otherwise foreign element. Multi-factor comes in pretty often in this jump box architecture. This definitely strengthens the authentication boundary between the zones by making the exploit process far more complex. I definitely recommend using this. It's a great technology to put into place, but it certainly comes with its own set of implementation challenges. Like everything, MFA can be deployed in a way that makes it prone to attack or bypass. One misconfiguration I've seen, making the MFA server accessible in the lower security zone. So just for example, one port that or a set of ports that I'd like to look for, or anything that might be related to that MFA server. And this could be something like SSH or something very telling like specific, a web service running on a specific port that's related to something like our RSA, the management console. So if the management console is accessible from the lower security zone, which is typically where we're running our testing from, we just need a way to log into that server. So part of another part of the implementation problem is allowing logon to the MFA console using just regular domain credentials. So that makes it very simple. Once we've compromised that lower security zone and the domain that's associated with it, we'll do something like dump nts.dit, and we've got the domain and admin credentials, and it's very likely then that we can log into the RSA console and we'll have full administrative access. There's some other really great ways to work around this if you don't have just domain credentials, but that's a pretty likely scenario. Once we have our credentials, we log in. We can do lots of interesting things like issue ourselves a soft token to get us to that higher security zone, and control logs, make it harder for anybody to stop us. If you're interested in talking a little bit or learning a little more about attacks against multi-factor, I definitely recommend taking a look by a coworker of mine, Josh Stone. He does a really great deep dive into multi-factor bypass. It's from DerbyCon 2015, and if you guys don't catch this link and you're interested, just ping me afterwards. I'll get that to you. So a couple of takeaways here. Consider technical controls around how users access the high security zones. For instance, session timeouts on remote desktop sessions. Consider the implications of compromise for critical systems. If you're not thinking about this from the assumed compromise perspective or assumed breach perspective, you're missing a lot of opportunities to harden your systems and the access methods. All right, next up is VDI. So VDI, or virtual desktop infrastructure, when used to deliver a desktop environment for the purposes of accessing a separate security zone, essentially is working like a jump box. So it's similar in a lot of ways to the last implementation. Just like the jump box design, VDI typically violates something called the clean source principle, which I'm going to jump out in a minute, but I've already sort of hinted at, and we'll see in just a moment in the next section. The first issue I want to address is abandoned sessions. So without screen locks, just like in the previous section, we can take advantage of somebody left a desktop logged in. And I know that sounds very sort of silly and non-technical, but I love the attack because it's sort of non-technical and it almost always works. If we're in an environment, we know that people are accessing that high security zone. We want to take advantage of those left open. We can just wait for them to go to lunch and look for something that indicates that they're logged out of their system and just lock the screen, and now we have access. So the next issue is insecure session brokers. If you can sort of just use your imagination a little bit on this, I know the image didn't come up great. It's actually showing one of the configuration screens from VMware's Horizon client, which is a VDI client. If you're not familiar with it, it's just a software that lets you log into a desktop, a created desktop for you. So one of the configuration options here says the text actually reads, "Do not verify server identity certificates." So the scenario that I'm trying to sort of hint at here is if we've compromised the host, you see it's connecting to the secure environment with the Horizon client. One of the settings is we can have it ignore bad certificates. So how might we leverage that? We know right off the bat that we can't rely on users to pay attention to something like, well, some of the colors came out there, like HTTPS warnings. People will just sort of click through this, even if previously we know that there was a good certificate here. You can be pretty confident that somebody is going to continue to log in, even if they see that warning show up. So use your imagination a little bit. One of the other configuration screens on the Horizon client, it lets you set the gateway that the client is pointed at. So as the bad guy, I'll probably want to make that point to me. I'll wait for the user to walk away, change the setting. You can also do this without interacting directly with the user's session by doing something like modifying the Windows registry. So setting yourself or setting myself as the gateway. Then we just have to tack together a little bit of code that will run a listener that captures the credentials and completes the connection when the user hits that logon button. So now, assuming that even if that VDI session has RSA, I think it's pretty common in that authentication scenario that the token is just typed as part of the password. So once they hit the login button, we capture this, we'll see we'll have everything. We'll have their password and we'll have that token that we can. Obviously, there's a timing element there, but then we just have to hack together a little more script that finishes the connection on our end, and we were able to log in as that user, and they might never be the wiser to the situation. One other example of a flawed configuration here that highlights the challenge of sort of the complexity of managing networks. During the scanning portion of an engagement, if we've detected, so this is two separate, use your imagination again, this is two separate VDI login screens. One of them, the one you can see the little RSA logo there, is configured to enforce multi-factor, so you have to type in the RSA, but these are both running in the same network. So if we're able to detect that there's two of them, and one of them doesn't have the RSA screen, guess which one I'm going to go after as the bad guy? The one that's missing multi-factor, which is exactly the same thing as not having multi-factor at all. I think this seems like an obvious flaw. If you're designing a network, yeah, you shouldn't do this, but it really kind of highlights the sorts of mistakes that we tend to like to exploit as penetration testers. So just like other implementations that we've covered, this solution violates that clean source principle that I mentioned we're going to touch on in just a moment. Essentially just requires that any security dependencies are as trustworthy as the object being secured, which we haven't really accomplished here. It's probably worth enforcing the use of signed certificates where possible, making your users aware that they exist. If, again, you can let them know, please don't click through those things. All right, the last bit, I just called it cloud, and I sort of cringed to use that term, but it fits well for what we're talking about here, so bear with me. So what we're really talking about here is organizations where, you can see most of that, organizations that offload everything to cloud service providers. So I've been really fortunate in the past year or so. I've had the chance to do pen tests for several smaller companies. Some of them you might classify as startups. In comparison to our standard larger enterprises, it requires a really different approach as far as the pen test goes. Many of these organizations are in sort of small offices that have very little local infrastructure but have very large production networks. So the users are essentially just connecting from an office that is more or less serving as an internet connection point. But they still have to do things like manage user accounts, email, and they do this by leveraging third-party providers. So one of these ran into recently on an internal penetration test was a single sign-on application. And I think the one that I'm showing here is called One Login, or yeah, One Login. This is a really great, it's kind of a neat application. So the user logs in one time and using something like SAML, they provide access to a dashboard that then gives you access to all your other applications. This is really handy for your users because they only have to log in once. It's exposed over to the internet. This is also really great for bad guys because now we have one login page that we have to attack as well. So just real quickly, I'm going to walk through the attack path that I took in this particular scenario. This is an email header, if you can use your imagination a little bit on this image. So obviously in a penetration test, one of the first things we want to do is some sort of intelligence gathering email addresses, figure out who their email provider is, which I'm highlighting in here. You just take a look at, if you can get somebody from the organization to email you, just take a look at their email header. One handy tip here, if you're using Google Apps, the Gmail login page is a really great place to validate email addresses. So if I have a list of potential ones, I can build some sort of semi-automation around checking to see if they're real email addresses. So once I have a list of what I believe are email addresses, this is a screenshot from Burp Suite. This is just running a login attack using those enumerated email addresses. Once I get a hit, I open up I can log into their one login page as that user. This is where the sort of privilege escalation, or maybe you think of this as lateral movement in terms of the penetration test. But essentially, I'm just digging for data. And depending on what kind of applications that particular user has access to, you can get really creative. Maybe they have GitHub is one of the applications that might be exposed here, which is great because you'll find source code, you'll find credentials, you'll find API keys. In particular, my attack path here was they were using AWS, but they were using Identity Manager and some multi-factor. But if you had the API key, you could use the AWS tool to pull down copies of things like their running EC2 instances and store data. So now I have an effective bypass to their multi-factor. And this is just showing the example of pulling down that AWS key that was stored in one of their GitHub repositories. And this would be success criteria, I think, in this situation. So just a couple of thoughts on this. The boundaries become very fuzzy and hard to define when an organization is leveraging these sorts of technologies. If you're relying on these services, You make sure you're applying the same rigor to separating zones you would in the more, just like in a more traditional enterprise network. Be very aware of where that authentication boundary is if you're exposing it to the internet. All right, so just to wrap up, I have a couple of secure design concepts. The first one I mentioned briefly before is the clean source principle. There's a sort of long-winded technical explanation that you can get from Microsoft if you want to go Google it. But the sort of shorter version is, if an adversary can control anything that's in effective control of a target object, they control that target object. Because of this, you have to ensure that the assurances for all dependencies are at or above the desired security level of the object that you're trying to take care of. In practice, it basically is, an attacker in control of an operating system has numerous ways to illicitly gain access to all the activity on that workstation, do things like impersonate legitimate user accounts. Practically for me, this means that if an attacker controls a system, they control any system that system is controlling. This is simple in principle, but I think applying this requires a pretty in-depth understanding of all of the control relationships of an asset, which I think anybody who's ever managed a Windows network can tell you that that can get pretty hairy. So the modern threat environment requires the organizations adopt this assume breach security posture when designing protections for high-value assets. When we approach system security from the perspective that we're already compromised, we just haven't discovered that compromise, always consider the ramifications from the perspective of the privileged users and workstations. So if you logged into a user's workstation with domain admin creds, then an attacker has compromised that system, you've created a potential for those credentials to be stolen. So the question I think you have to ask is, can someone leverage those credentials then to gain access to some resource that I wouldn't want them to be able to? Consider any systems that have high value, that access high value assets as a special class of system, so that you can avoid cross-contaminating access privileges and zones. One way you might go about this, provide a high security workstation for privileged users. This could be a separate physical machine like I mentioned earlier. One other thing you do is leverage virtualization. We also talked a little bit about that. I think in the case of virtualization, it's also important to think about we're never logging into the lower security system to access our higher security system, because then we've cross-contaminated and we're no longer clean in terms of source. Administrative privileges, the security of most or all businesses, business assets in an organization depends on the integrity of the privileged accounts that administer and manage IT systems. So securing privileged access is a critical step to establishing security. Lots of admin credentials and admin credential use means lots of chances for an attacker to capture those privileged accounts. Know where your administrative privileges are being used. Limit role privileges to the minimum required. I know that's sort of like Security Day 101, but it seems like it's rarely implemented. Limit the number of hosts on which administrative credentials are exposed, and ensure administrative tasks are not performed on hosts they're used for standard activities like email and web browsing. Poking holes to your high-value assets. Another critical piece to consider in any design is the complexity of management. Juggling the demands of environments can be a massive challenge. So a lot of the flaws, or maybe even most of the flaws that I find during a pen test, tie back to this one change we made this one time from that one guy in marketing, and then we never put back because we forgot and we didn't have a change request in place. So those exceptions add up, and part of the bad guy skill set is finding those holes. So if they're there, there's a good chance that they're going to be able to find them. Create strictly defined programmatic methods for managing systems and service configurations, and ensure that even if you change something to some configuration you know is less secure, there's something that's built in to automatically put it back to the way that you think it should be. One way I've had this described to me is the DevOps approach to security, which I know DevOps is kind of just a buzzword, but I think that the idea works well here. So we want to have some sort of programmatic way for managing security changes. So just wrapping up, my goals here for today were to prevent a couple of security architectures that I think are very common, but give you the bad guy perspective on those architectures, and get a little insight I've gained from trying to get past the security implementations. I know a couple of shortcomings of the talk are the reality of any of these implementations is far more complex than anything I've talked about here, and I understand that, but I still think that the concepts apply well. And I think that there's a lot of depth that could be taken for any single one of these topics, and maybe even you could write a whole book about some of them. And before I jump into questions, I really enjoy doing things like BSides because I get to meet lots of people, and usually the conversations I have with people afterwards, I learn lots of interesting things. Please come talk to me afterwards. Look me up, send me an email, look me up on Twitter. I'm always happy to connect with everybody. Any questions? Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody.